Chapter 1. She laughs a little louder than the moment calls for, then pulls it back just enough to keep it from standing out, like she felt it slip for a second and corrected it mid-air. You're sitting there watching it happen in real time without reacting to it, because nothing about it is big enough to call out. The conversation keeps moving, she stays engaged, everything looks normal if you zoom out far enough. But up close, there are these small adjustments happening constantly, like she's tuning how she shows up second by second. And if you stay present long enough, you start realizing that what you're interacting with isn't fixed. It's being shaped as you go. She tells you things that sound complete until you sit with them for more than a few seconds. And then you notice how much space is inside what she said. It's clean. It's simple. It answers the question without opening anything else up. You don't feel lied to. You just feel like there's more that didn't get included. And the strange part is, she doesn't act like anything was left out. Because from her perspective, nothing important was. That's where most men miss it. They think the absence of information means there's nothing there, when really it just means it wasn't offered. You'll notice how certain topics never fully land. They just pass through the conversation like they weren't meant to stay. She might mention something about her past, or what she's been doing, or who she's been around, and it comes out in a way that doesn't invite any follow-up. Not because she shuts it down directly, but because the way it's presented doesn't give you anything solid to grab onto. It's like trying to hold on to something that was never meant to be held. It slips through your hands before you even realize you tried to catch it. And by the time you think about going back to it, the moment has already moved on. You don't question it in the moment because there's nothing obvious to question, and that's exactly why it works the way it does. Everything is just clear enough to keep things moving, just smooth enough to avoid friction, just complete enough to feel like you understand what's going on. But if you slow it down, if you actually sit inside what's being said instead of letting it pass through you, you start noticing how much is left untouched. It's not hidden in some complex way. It's just never brought into focus. There's a difference between what's said and what's revealed. And most men treat those two things like they're the same. They hear something, they process it, and they build their understanding from that point forward. What they don't realize is that what's revealed isn't always contained in the words themselves. It's in the timing, the delivery, the way certain things are included while others aren't. You're not being given the full structure. You're being given a version that functions without needing to explain itself completely. And you've felt the effect of that before, even if you didn't have a clear way to describe it. That moment where everything seems fine, but something about it doesn't fully settle, like your mind is slightly behind what's actually happening. You replay conversations later and realize there were parts that didn't connect the way you thought they did. You remember how certain things were said and start hearing them differently after the fact. It's not that anything changes. It's that your perspective catches up to something you didn't notice in the moment. She's not thinking about it the way you are. She's not sitting there planning what to hide or what to reveal in some calculated way. It's more natural than that, more automatic, more built into how she navigates interactions. She shares what fits the moment, what keeps things moving, what maintains the tone she wants to keep. Everything else stays where it is, not because it needs to be protected, but because it doesn't need to be included. That distinction matters more than you realize, because it changes how you interpret everything you're being shown. You've probably walked away from situations feeling like you didn't fully understand what happened, even though nothing seemed confusing at the time. You try to piece it together afterward, going over what was said, how it was said, what you might have missed. And no matter how much you think about it, there's still a part that feels incomplete, like there's something just outside your reach that would make it all make sense. That feeling isn't coming from nowhere. It's coming from the gap between what you were given and what was actually there, Once you start noticing that gap, you can't unsee it, and it changes how you move without you having to force anything. You stop taking everything at face value, not in a suspicious way, but in a way that recognizes there's always more happening than what's directly in front of you. You start paying attention to the parts that don't get explained, the moments that pass too smoothly, the details that feel slightly incomplete. And that awareness puts you in a different position entirely. Because now you're not just reacting to what's being shown, you're reading what's actually there. If you've ever sat in a conversation and felt like you were missing something without knowing what it was, you already understand this more than you think you do. You've been picking up on it the whole time. You just didn't trust it enough to take it seriously. Go ahead and like the video if that feeling just clicked into place for you. Because once you start recognizing it, you're going to see it in places you never noticed before. And if you want to keep sharpening that awareness, stay locked in. Because this only gets clearer from here. Chapter 2. She pauses for half a second before answering something simple, something that shouldn't require any thought, and that pause tells you more than the answer ever will. It's quick, almost invisible, just enough time for something to pass through her mind before she speaks. Then, the response comes out, smooth, clean, easy to accept, like it was always going to be that way. If you weren't paying attention, you'd take it at face value and keep moving without a second thought. But that pause doesn't come from nowhere, and once you start noticing it, you begin to see how often it shows up in moments that should be effortless. You're not used to sitting inside those small gaps, because most of the time you move past them without stopping. Conversations are supposed to flow. That's what you've been taught. Keep things going. Don't get stuck on anything that might slow the rhythm down. So when something interrupts that rhythm for even a fraction of a second, your instinct is to ignore it and stay on track. Meanwhile, she's already made a decision in that gap, chosen what version of the answer to give, chosen how much to include and how much to leave out. And by the time you hear the words, the moment where the real choice happened is already gone. This is where most men get lost without realizing it, because they focus entirely on what's said and miss where the meaning actually sits. They hear the answer, they process it, and they build their understanding from that point forward. They don't think about the space before the answer, the slight delay, the adjustment that happened before anything was spoken. That's where the information lives, in that small window where the response is being shaped before it reaches you. Once you miss that, everything else feels complete even when it isn't. You might notice it more when the question carries a little more weight, when it touches something that isn't as simple as it seems on the surface. The pause stretches just a little longer, the eyes shift for a second, the tone changes slightly before settling into something controlled. Then, the answer comes out, and it sounds just as calm and steady as everything else she's said. But if you were present enough to catch that moment before it, you already know there was more behind it than what you just heard. You felt it before it was spoken, even if you didn't know how to explain it to yourself. She's not trying to confuse you, and that's the part that makes it easy to overlook. This isn't about creating some complicated illusion or playing a game you're supposed to figure out. It's simply how she moves, how she filters things in real time, how she decides what belongs in the conversation and what doesn't. Those decisions happen quickly, naturally, without hesitation once they're made. The only hesitation is in that brief moment before the words come out. And that's the only part you're not meant to hold on to. You've probably experienced it more times than you can count, especially in moments where something felt slightly off, but you couldn't point to anything specific. You leave the interaction thinking everything was fine, but there's a small part of you that keeps replaying certain moments without knowing why. You remember how she answered, but more than that, you remember how it felt right before she answered. That feeling lingers longer than the words themselves, because it's tied to something you didn't fully process at the time. And if you're honest with yourself, there were times you caught it clearly and chose to move past it anyway. Not because you didn't notice, but because acknowledging it would have forced you to step outside the flow of the interaction. It would have required you to sit in that moment a little longer, to question something that didn't present itself as a problem. So you let it go, and the conversation continued, and everything stayed smooth. But that smoothness came at the cost of clarity, and you felt that later without being able to trace it back to a specific point. What starts changing is when you stop rushing past those moments, when you allow yourself to actually register what happens before the words. You don't interrupt, you don't confront, you don't break the flow, you just notice it fully instead of letting it slip by. That awareness builds over time, and the more it builds, the less you rely on what's being said to understand what's happening. You start seeing the structure underneath the conversation instead of just the surface, and that structure tells you more than any explanation ever could. Once you see it clearly, it shifts how you interpret everything that follows, because now you know where to look. You're not waiting for something obvious to show up. You're paying attention to the subtle moments that usually get ignored. And those moments are consistent. They repeat in different forms, in different conversations, with different women, but they all carry the same underlying pattern. The words change, the situations change, but the process stays the same, and that's what gives you a clearer understanding than anything you could be told directly. Chapter 3. She talks about what she wants like it's already settled, like it's something she's clear on, something she's already figured out before you ever showed up. You hear it, and it sounds structured, like she knows exactly what direction she's moving in, exactly what she's looking for, exactly what fits and what doesn't. It gives you something solid to work with, something you can align yourself to, something that feels stable enough to trust. But if you stay with it long enough, if you watch how those words hold up over time, you start noticing how flexible that clarity really is. It shifts without being announced, adjusts without being explained, and somehow still sounds just as certain every time it's spoken. You'll hear her describe the kind of man she's drawn to, the kind of situation she wants, the kind of energy she responds to, and it all comes out clean and consistent in the moment. It feels like a blueprint, like something you can understand and move within without guessing. But then you watch her respond to something that doesn't fully match what she said, and there's no conflict in it from her side. She moves toward it naturally, engages with it easily, and doesn't feel the need to reconcile the difference out loud. That's where most men get confused, because they're trying to match behavior to words, while she's moving based on what feels right in the moment without needing to explain the shift. You might think you misunderstood something, or that there's a missing detail you didn't catch, because the two don't line up the way you expect them to. You go back to what she said, trying to make sense of it, trying to find where it connects to what you're seeing now. But the connection isn't always there in the way you're looking for it, because those words weren't meant to lock anything in place. They were accurate in the moment they were said, but they weren't fixed in a way that prevents them from changing as the situation evolves. That fluidity doesn't feel strange to her, because she's not holding on to those statements the way you are. You start noticing how often her preferences seem to adjust based on how she feels about the situation in front of her. Something she said she wouldn't tolerate suddenly becomes something she's willing to engage with. Something she claimed to value strongly doesn't carry the same weight when the context changes. And none of it comes with an explanation, none of it gets revisited or corrected. It just moves forward as if it's always been consistent. From the outside, it looks like contradiction, but from her perspective, it's simply movement, responding to what feels right without needing to justify it. This is where most men start trying to stabilize something that was never meant to stay still. They hold on to her words, treat them like rules, and then get thrown off when those rules don't apply the way they expected them to. They try to align themselves to something that keeps shifting, and the more they try to keep up, the more they feel like they're losing ground. It creates a kind of frustration that's hard to explain, because everything sounds clear but doesn't behave that way in reality. And that disconnect keeps them searching for consistency in a place where consistency isn't the point. You've probably experienced moments where you felt like you were doing everything according to what she said she wanted, and still something didn't land the way you expected. You followed the direction you were given, you stayed within the lines she described, and somehow it didn't create the response you thought it would. That's because the words weren't the full picture, they were just a snapshot of how she felt at that time. The real driver sits underneath that, in how she responds to what she feels in the moment, not in what she previously defined as important. Once you start seeing that, you stop treating her words like something that needs to be decoded perfectly. You still listen, you still pay attention, but you don't rely on them as the foundation for understanding everything that follows. You watch how she moves, how she reacts, how her energy shifts depending on what's happening in front of her. That gives you a clearer sense of what's actually guiding her, because it's consistent in a way her words aren't meant to be. It's not about catching her being inconsistent, it's about recognizing what actually stays steady beneath the surface. That realization changes how you move without you having to force anything, because you're no longer trying to match something that keeps changing. You're responding to what's real in the moment instead of what was said before it. That makes your presence feel more grounded, more aligned with what's actually happening instead of what you thought should be happening. And that difference is something she can feel immediately, even if she never puts it into words herself. Chapter 4. She pulls back slightly, not enough for you to call it distance, just enough for you to feel it if you're paying attention. The conversation still exists, the connection still feels present, but something about the way she's engaging shifts just a little bit. It's subtle, almost like she's testing how the space changes when she gives less without saying anything about it. You're still there, still responding, still trying to keep things steady. And that's where most men start compensating without realizing it. They lean in a little more, they give a little more. They try to fill whatever just opened up because they feel that gap and want to close it. That's the part she never explains because she doesn't need to, and most men react to it automatically anyway. You'll feel yourself adjusting, maybe sending another message, maybe extending the conversation, maybe putting in a little extra effort to bring things back to where they were. It doesn't feel like overreaching in the moment. It feels like maintaining the connection, like doing what makes sense given the shift you just felt. But from her side, she's watching how you respond to that space, not consciously analyzing every detail, but feeling the way your energy changes when hers pulls back. And that response tells her more than anything you could say directly. You've probably seen how quickly things can tilt when you start giving more than the moment is asking for, even if it's just slightly more. The balance changes, not in a way that's obvious at first, but in a way that slowly shifts how she experiences you. You go from being someone she's meeting in the moment to someone who's trying to maintain something, and that difference carries weight whether it's acknowledged or not. She doesn't need to explain it, because she feels it, and that feeling guides how she continues to engage with you moving forward. What stays hidden in that dynamic is how intentional that space actually is, even when it looks natural on the surface. That slight pullback isn't random. It's part of how she gauges what's solid and what's reactive. She doesn't say, "I'm stepping back to see how you respond," because that would break the process entirely. Instead, she lets it happen in a way that feels organic, in a way that doesn't draw attention to itself. And because it's not labeled, you experience it as something you need to adjust to instead of something you can simply observe. You might think the solution is to hold back as well, to mirror that distance, to play it the same way she is, but that turns it into something controlled again. You start managing your responses, measuring your timing, trying to match her movement instead of staying grounded in your own. That puts you right back into a reactive position, just in a different form. You're still adjusting based on what she's doing, still letting her set the pace of how you show up, even if it looks more restrained from the outside. The shift happens when you stop trying to close the space and stop trying to match it, and instead let it exist without changing how you move. You don't rush in to fill it, and you don't pull away to mirror it. You stay where you are. That stability changes the dynamic in a way that doesn't need to be announced, because now the space doesn't pull you out of position. It becomes something that exists without controlling your response, and that's something she feels immediately, even if she doesn't consciously recognize why it stands out. You've probably had moments where you didn't react, not because you were trying to hold back, but because you were genuinely unaffected by the shift. And in those moments, the interaction carried a different kind of weight, something that felt more grounded, more steady, more centered. That's not something you forced. It's something that happened because you weren't chasing the connection or trying to maintain it artificially. You were just present, and that presence didn't change when the dynamic shifted slightly. Once you see how often that pattern shows up, you start recognizing it in real time instead of after the fact. You notice the small pullbacks, the subtle changes in engagement, the moments where the energy shifts without explanation. And instead of reacting to them automatically, you let them pass through without disrupting your position. That alone changes how the interaction unfolds, because now you're not being moved by every small adjustment that happens. You're steady in a way that doesn't need to be reinforced, and that steadiness is what separates you from the reactions she's used to seeing. Chapter 5. She circles back without saying she's circling back. And if you're not paying attention, it feels like coincidence instead of a pattern. The tone is lighter, the timing feels casual, and it comes in a way that doesn't require you to acknowledge anything that happened before. You might get a message that sounds like nothing ever shifted, or a conversation that picks up without referencing the gap that existed. It's smooth in a way that lets everything reset without needing to address anything directly. And if you accept that reset without thinking about it, you stay inside the version of events that keeps everything simple. You'll notice how easy it is to fall into that, because it removes any tension that might have been building in the background. There's no need to question what happened, no need to revisit anything, no need to make sense of the shifts you felt earlier. Everything moves forward as if it's always been consistent, and that consistency feels comfortable enough to accept. But underneath that comfort, the same pattern is still there, just presented in a way that doesn't force you to look at it. The reset doesn't change what happened. It just changes how it's being acknowledged. Most men treat that moment like a second chance to get things right, like an opportunity to align themselves better now that things feel open again. They lean into it with more effort, more attention, more focus, because it feels like things are back in a good place. But that approach pulls them right back into reacting to the surface instead of understanding what's actually happening. They engage with what's being presented now without connecting it to what was already shown before. And that disconnect keeps them moving in a loop without realizing it. What stays hidden is how predictable that cycle actually is once you see it clearly. The initial interaction feels engaging, something shifts subtly, space is created without explanation, and then everything returns in a way that feels natural again. It's not random, and it's not something that only happens occasionally. It's a pattern that repeats in different forms depending on the situation. The details change, the timing changes, but the structure underneath it stays the same. And once you recognize that structure, you stop being surprised by how things move. You don't need to interrupt the reset or call it out directly, because doing that pulls you back into trying to control something that's already showing itself. Instead, you stay aware of what you've already seen, and you let that awareness guide how you engage moving forward. You don't treat the moment like it erased what happened before, and you don't act like everything is starting fresh. You carry the full picture with you, not in a way that creates tension, but in a way that keeps you grounded in what's actually been shown. That changes the way you respond without you having to force anything. Because now you're not moving based on what's being presented in the moment alone. You're moving with a sense of continuity, understanding that what you see now is part of a larger pattern that didn't just disappear. That steadiness shows up in your timing, in your tone, in how much you invest in the interaction without needing to overthink it. You're not chasing the reset, and you're not resisting it either. You're simply not being pulled by it the way you would have been before. You've probably felt how different it is when you're not reacting to every shift, when you're not trying to adjust to every change in energy. There's a calmness in that, a sense that you're not being moved around by something you don't fully understand. You're present, but you're not attached to the surface of what's happening. And that creates a kind of stability that stands out without needing to be explained. It's not something you announce or make obvious. It's something that shows up in how you carry yourself through the interaction. If you've been following this closely, and you can see these patterns in your own experiences, then you already know how much this changes the way you look at things. You're not guessing anymore. You're not trying to piece things together after the fact. You're seeing it as it happens. Go ahead and subscribe if you want to keep sharpening that awareness, because the more you refine it, the more clearly everything starts to make sense without needing to be explained. And if this hit in a way that made you rethink moments you've already been through, share it with someone who's still trying to figure out why things never quite add up. Because once you see it clearly, you don't move the same way again.